You see the introduction of the movie Infamy on Trial, your book, all of a sudden, Hollywood. What was your reaction the first time you walked in and actually saw it on the big screen?
Well, my first reaction when I knew that the option was actually going to be exercised and the movie was going to be made was great uneasiness, because you wonder, what are they going to do with my story? How are they going to treat it? My baby. Are they going to sensationalize it, introduce sex into it? All of these concerns that somehow you have lost control of your story. But when I finally saw the production, I was just delighted, because it was true not only to my book, but more importantly, it was true to the spirit of the trial. So I was very pleased. What started me on writing this book begins almost a half a century before. I was a high school student in 1946 in my hometown in upstate New York, when there appeared in the local newspaper a wire service photograph of Hermann Goering in death. Hermann Goering, as I'm sure most of you know, managed to cheat the hangman at Nuremberg and managed to do away with himself, biting into a cyanide capsule just briefly before he was to be hanged. And this photograph showed Goering's corpse, his face contorted in a terrible grimace, and it was just burned indelibly into my memory. I never forgot that photograph. And through the years, every once in a while, I would return to the idea of something about Nuremberg, and yet it wasn't until almost, as I say, a half a century later that the opportunity came along to write the book. It's an international story in which the American role is the dynamo. When the trial was being organized, very difficult period, because there was no body of law really to try international criminals. There was no court. There wasn't even a courthouse. There was no existing judiciary. So the principal person in solving these problems, the man who gave it the most energy, was the man after whom your center is named here, Justice Robert Jackson. So while it winds up as a trial with German defendants, American judges, French judges, British judges, and Soviet judges, the spirit of it is carried through by the Americans, and I might add, the Americans picked up the tab for all of the expenses that were involved in conducting the Nuremberg trial. I was Governor Rockefeller's speechwriter for 9 years, and then I was Vice President Rockefeller's speechwriter for 2 years. I always found the Civil War somehow unreal. It would be as though today you would have people from, let's say, New England, New York State, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, going to war against people in California, Oregon, state of Washington, and killing each other in massive, massive numbers. And the idea that Americans did that, except that the axis was north and south, instead of my example, east and west, it always seemed somehow unreal to me. And I wanted to be able to understand what had fed that bloody conflict. I started writing that actually while I was still on the governor's payroll as kind of a psychological life raft. I was so sick of writing speeches that I started writing this book. So it was kind of a declaration of independence from speech writing. And I had cultivated a friend at the National Archives. And he came to my office one day and he dropped a big fat loose leaf binder on my desk. And he said, "There's the book you want to write." He said, "In there are the first revelations of something that's been kept secret for 35 years. And that is that during World War II, the United States penetrated Nazi Germany with secret agents through the OSS, which was the predecessor agency of the CIA. So I immediately began reading what was in this declassified war history about this operation, and I was hooked on it. And it was not too difficult to get a contract to write that book because it was an untold story. Well, I've touched on it. Piercing the Reich was the book that dealt with how the United States infiltrated Nazi Germany. We had spies. We had spies in 60 German cities by the end of the war, something like 250 agents who had very sophisticated electronics gear that was very pioneering for that period. And you had these people who would be slipped in as conscript workers or as German soldiers, and they would broadcast essentially to airplanes circling overhead that were on the same frequency, and they would be telling where German units were located, what was the production in this particular plant, where were they making bombs, where were they making planes and tanks. So it was a fairly successful enterprise, and it was America's maturation as an intelligence service, penetrating into Nazi Germany, which was not easy because Germany was in the iron grip of the Gestapo. It wasn't like parachuting into France where there were safe houses and resistance people who would help you. This was going into the enemy heartland. Well, he's critical in that story. Donovan was America's first spy master. He was created head of the Office of Strategic Services in 1942, and he built this first agency, which in time transforms itself into the Central Intelligence Agency.
He's from Western New York.
Buffalo boy.
That's right.
That's right, yeah.
And of course, his paths intersect with Justice Jackson's, as you described in the Infamy and trial.
He and Jackson started out beautifully because General Donovan, as an intelligence official, had gathered an enormous amount of information on what went on inside Nazi Germany and figures in the German hierarchy. So Justice Jackson eagerly brought him into the mix, and it was a clash of egos. Two gentlemen with very strong egos, and General Donovan just drifted off and disappears from the Nuremberg scene. Well, I learned how to interview people mostly by making mistakes, and probably one of the greatest and most searing lessons I had was with somebody named Fred Friendly. I don't know how many of you will remember. Fred Friendly was the executive producer of all of the great documentaries done with Ed Murrow. They were partners creating See It Now and other great early television. So I was writing a biography of Ed Murrow and naturally wanted to talk to Fred Friendly. Murrow was gone by that time. And I read somewhere that Fred Friendly was such a hard driving executive that 3 of the assistant producers who had worked with him had suffered heart attacks. So I made my first appointment with Friendly, and we were about maybe halfway into the interview, which I thought was going pretty well. And I said, Fred, I read somewhere that you were a very hard-charging boss, and that while working for you, 3 of your assistants had heart attacks. He said, what? What are you talking about? And he said, you sit here. And he hollered down the hall of the building he was housed in, and he said, Johnny, get up here. And he said, am I the kind of boss that gives people heart attacks? And the guy said, no, Fred. So then he said, out. To me, he said, out. That's it. We're finished. And he was my key witness in writing this book. Nobody knew Ed Murrow better than Fred Friendly. And it took another 3 or 4 months of cajoling, begging, crawling on my hands and knees to get back. So I learned from that when you interview people, if you got mean questions, you ask them last. I would like to be thought of as an author who took fairly serious subjects of history and biography and made them readable.